And let's go ahead and let's open our Bibles to Daniel chapter 11. We are in the next to last chapter of the book of Daniel. This is chapters, if you remember when we got into chapter 10, chapters 10, 11, and 12 deal with this final vision that Daniel has that is revealed to him. In chapter 10, which we finished that, we looked at some of the preparation and Daniel got to see the Lord in the midst, even before the vision came. And we looked at some of that, his prayer and the vision that he had of God. We got a little bit of insight into some spiritual warfare going on and how God still overcame and how God strengthened Daniel. Now in chapter 11 is where we're going to actually get into this vision that he has given, or this prophecy that is given to Daniel. And then when we get into chapter 12, we'll look at this final message or the final recorded message that is given to Daniel. So here we are, Daniel chapter 11. Now, the timing of we're still, if you remember back in chapter 10, verse 1, we're still in the third year of Cyrus here. And Cyrus, when he took over, the Persian king, when they took over the area of Babylon and took over these Jewish slaves that had been taken captive into Babylon, he began to allow some to return. If you remember in the book of Ezra, initially, not everybody got to return, but some got to return with him. And so with that going on, Daniel he's praying and he's seeking God, and he's concerned about the future because there's already been some visions that he's had where he's been given some details about struggle and persecution of the people of God, of the Jews in particular there. And so in the midst of that, he has this vision that is really all future to Daniel. All of it is future to Daniel. Some of it is future to us, but some of it will be past to us. And it's kind of neat to be able to look at what God said to Daniel would happen and look at it on this side, looking back and say, well, that actually did happen. And that's what we'll see a lot of in the book of Daniel. In the chapter 11 of the book of Daniel. And the historical details that Daniel 11, we've seen some in some of these prophecies. It's really going to get specific in Daniel chapter 11, and they are astounding. Now, understand this about biblical prophecy. When people today talk about being a prophet or making a prophecy, it is not the same as biblical prophecy. Because prophecy today is inconsistent because it's filtered through the mind of man and through the knowledge of man and through the mouth of man. It was here as well, but the Holy Spirit is overseeing this prophecy. And the prophecy that we have here is inspired. Matter of fact, in the Bible, if a prophet made a prediction and he was not 100% right, he was stoned. If we did that today, we wouldn't have any prophets. Or people claiming to be prophets. Because there's been a lot of prophecies that have been made about elections, about future events, and that just have not come to pass. It didn't happen the way those prophets. As a matter of fact, if you hear somebody doing that, predicting the future in a dogmatic way, saying this is from God, it's going to happen, and it doesn't happen, it wasn't from God, and I wouldn't listen to that person anymore. Matter of fact, I wouldn't listen to them if they're claiming that it's from God and doing that. But because of biblical prophecy, Holy Spirit prophecy, God-inspired prophecy is 100% correct. And that's exactly what we see in Daniel. This vision that Daniel is given here, especially as we look back at the part that is passed to us, it is 100% true. Even to the point that Daniel chapter 11, as well as other parts of Daniel as well that we've been looking about, the liberal folks, the folks that don't believe, they attack Daniel chapter 11 up one side and down the other because they're saying there is no way Daniel could know all of this before it happened. There's no way this could be revealed to Daniel before it happened. So they're saying it was written years after it happened, and then they put it like it happened to Daniel. And that's not what happened at all. This is given before it happens, and because it's given from God, it's 100% accurate in the details that are given. Now, it's 100% accurate in the details that are given. Every detail about history is not given in here. but enough is given that we can apply, we can look in history and say, that happened, and that happened, and that happened, and that happened, and this is going to happen just like that happened. And so that's where we are in Daniel chapter 11. So let's look, and there's really two major sections in Daniel chapter 11 with this prophecy. There's one section dealing with the past, and there's one section dealing with the future as far as Daniel is concerned. The section dealing with the past, I know we're going to cover tonight because it's only one verse. And then all the rest of the verses are future to Daniel. So Roman numeral 1 in your outline, let's look at the past ministry that is taking place here in verse 1, where he says, also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. Now, notice it's in quotation marks. This is not Daniel speaking. This is that angel back in chapter 10 that is speaking. It could be Gabriel. He's not definitely identified as Gabriel. A lot of people think it was, and I kind of lean that way a little bit, but we don't know for sure. But it is an angelic being. And he's still speaking to Daniel. And so he's the one that is speaking here. And he mentions this ministry with Darius that happened earlier. So remember, we're in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Here it talks about in the first year of Darius the Mede. And remember, we talked about Cyrus the Persian, Darius the Mede, same guy and stuff there. But he's talking about the first year. So he's going back to before chapter 10 and saying that he was there involved, that the angel was involved in the ministry of Darius in year 1, when he began letting, and what happened in year 1, that's when he began to let some of the Jews go back with Ezra. And so that's what he's talking about here. In that first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and to strengthen him, that just like God said they would begin to go back, the Jews began to go back. Because when the Medes and the Persians, when they took over Babylon, it wasn't just by their own might and power. God was doing this because he was going to bring his people back. And he was going to bring his people back to the land. Matter of fact, back in Daniel chapter 5, if you remember way back then, he prophesied that this would happen and that his people would begin to return. And so that's exactly what happens here. God's prophecy of the Jews returning from the exile, it begins there. And that's important that we see that we understand that, because it proves that God is true. He said it would happen, and it happened. Also proves that God's in control, even to the point that he took Babylon down and brought in the Medes and the Persians just so his people could go back. It also proves that God cares. God cares about the Jews, but God cares for us as well, because guess what? There ain't no Messiah dying in Jerusalem if they're still in Babylon. And so he was, of course, that happens hundreds of years later, but he's moving toward that. He's moving toward Messiah. He's moving toward the birth of Christ. He's moving toward the death and resurrection of Jesus, that would his death being the atonement for all our sins. So that's what's happening here. Notice just there in verse 1 what it said here. He says, the angel says, first of all, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. So the word stood there is a military term, and it means to stand in victory. That Darius is the one, he could have said, look at what I did and stuff like that. And the angel said, no, it was the work of God is what it was. The Darius did this, but it was God that ordained this and God that put this together. And he says, I stood up to confirm. That means to support. And so he's that unseen spiritual support, not because Darius was a good guy, but because he's moving in answer to prophecy and moving the people back, even guiding the king's decisions. And when did God all of a sudden stop doing that, or get to the point that he couldn't do that anymore? Can God still do that? Yes. Can he guide the king's decisions today? Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, he can. It's the same God. Same God. And so we need to be praying to him for that. And then he says, and strengthen him. And so just a reminder that Darius had power, but his power came from God. The power to overcome Belshazzar, that last king of Babylon, and to conquer that powerful kingdom. And so every victory that they won there was a work of God and was a gift of God. And so he's just reminding them of that. He says, now remember, when all this began in motion and stuff, that God was in control. And now as we begin to talk about this future vision, that's Roman numeral 2, a future vision, God's still in control. God worked through sending the Jews into captivity. God is working through sending the Jews back home out of captivity. And these other things I'm fixing to tell you about, God's in control there as well. You can trust him. So in verses 2 through 45, we have this future vision. Now notice in verse 2 when he starts off, he says, and now I will tell you the truth. He's not saying everything else was a lie, all right? He wasn't saying, now, I was preaching, but now I'm going to tell you the truth. No, he's not saying that. What he is saying, he's just confirming that as he talks about these things, and there's going to be some frightening things that he's going to reveal, and the details he's going to reveal, he's just letting Daniel know, and he's letting us know when he's talking about that this is the way that things will unfold. It's going to happen this way. And all those things that were future to Daniel and past to us, we see that's exactly the way that it happened. I mean, it's shocking. It's amazing. It's unbelievable. But it's absolutely perfectly true. Why? Because God is absolutely perfectly true. And everything he says is true. And so that would provide for Daniel and for us as well reassurance for the future. Yes, God, as he says here, trouble's coming. And as he's told us, as we get closer and closer to the second coming of Jesus, trouble's coming. Trouble's coming. Just get ready for it. Yes, there's going to be victories and there's going to be joys and there's going to be people saved and there's plenty to rejoice in, but it's going to get hard and it's going to get harder. Trouble's coming, but God's still on the throne. Even when the trouble comes, God is still on the throne. Now, in verses 2 through 35, letter A there, we see the immediate future. And by immediate future, we're going to cover hundreds of years. But what I'm talking about there is the things that are future to Daniel, but past to us. For Daniel, it's future. For us, it is past. And as he talks about these things, he doesn't give every detail about the situations that are going to happen, about the ones that are going to be kings, and doesn't cover every king that there's going to be between this time and between the time that Jesus comes or anything like that. But the ones that he does mention are mentioned for a purpose, and a lot of it is in relationship to the Jews and to Israel. And so he's letting him know that there's something coming, but he's also letting him know before that comes, these things are going to happen, and I'm in control of these things because they're going to happen exactly the way I'm telling you. So when this happens, you know that I'm still in control. It may look like I'm not, but I am. That's what God is doing in this vision. So number one under A there, the first thing that we see in verse 2 is we see these kings of Persia. The Medo-Persian Empire is ruling at this time. And so he deals with that immediate future of these kings of Persia, where Daniel is right now as this vision is coming to him. Look at verse 2. He says, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than them all. By his strength and through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. And if you know your history, you know what he's talking about here. This is exactly what happened. You could say, over these next 33 verses or so, we're going to be doing a history class, a history 101 to us. But it's not really history 101 for Daniel. It's future 101. It's a future class for him. And we need to keep that in mind as we're going through this. But he talks about these kings of Persia. The 3 kings, and there are 3 kings that follow Darius and Cyrus there. They're Cambyses the second, Smerdis, Darius the first, Histosopes. I don't know if I'm saying all this right, but those are these Persian kings. And then he talks about the 4th shall be far richer. The 4th king is someone you may have heard about if you remember world history and stuff. His name is Xerxes. Xerxes the first, Xerxes the Great. Even if you don't know, weren't up on your history, if you ever watched the movie 300, that's the king that is there. He is a rich and strong king. And if you remember the story about the 300, this Persian king that comes, he's the one that leads this massive attack on Greece. That's what it says there. It says, he shall stir up all against the realm of Greece. That's exactly what happened. The fourth king, Xerxes, goes against Greece, and he attacks. At this time, these Greek city-states are that's what they are. They're independent, and they're these city-states, and they can't even get along with one another. And then he comes along, and he brings his great army against them, and his attack unites the Greek city-states against a common enemy. Now, this is written, now Daniel is 50 years before Xerxes comes to the scene. So it's written before Xerxes is even born, as he's writing this, okay? And he's saying that this fourth king is the one that's going to go against Greece. It's like someone in the 1960s writing about 9/11. You know, that's what we're talking about. And I don't know about you, but I don't remember reading anything that somebody wrote in the 1960s about 9/11. I mean, that's 50 years before somebody before I was born writing about 9/11. You know, that's ridiculous. But here's God doing things that only God can do. And he says, this is going to happen. There's going to be 1, 2, 3 kings. That fourth king is going against Greece and uniting everyone against Greece, and actually uniting Greece against everyone else. Which leads us to the number 2, the king of Greece. Because Xerxes does that, and all of a sudden the Greeks unite together, and they drive Xerxes out of there, and they become the world power. Verse 3 says, then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. So there's a new kingdom. And if you remember, after the Persian kingdom, there was a kingdom of bronze, and that statue that we saw way back in Daniel chapter 2. This is the kingdom of bronze. And it talks about this mighty king. Anybody got a guess who that mighty king might be from Greece? Alexander the Great. He is one of the mightiest kings that there's been as far as conquering other kingdoms that there has been. He had a great dominion. He had the biggest empire up to that time that there had been. And matter of fact, he conquered the others so rapidly and so quickly and so easily that before he died, he cried because he had nothing else left to conquer. It moved so quick. He died at a very young age, but he had great dominion. And he did according to his will. In verse 4 it says, and when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided toward the four winds of heaven. But not among his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be uprooted even for others besides these. Now this thing is written 90 years before Alexander the Great, and what happens after. And guess what happened after him? The kingdom was divided. Can you guess into how many different divisions? 4. That's what it says right there in verse 4. It says 4 divisions. And that's exactly what happened. And you'd assume that would be 4 of his sons ruling that, right? But that's not what it says. It says it wasn't his sons. And it wasn't his sons. It was the commanders that took over. He didn't have his posterity. His sons were murdered after he died, and it was divided among his commanders into 4 divisions. Now, from here on, we focus on 2 of those 4 divisions, which fought over Israel. Again, we're focusing not just on the world, but on Israel itself. And again, this is written, what Daniel is receiving. Daniel chapter 11 is written 90 years before Alexander, and then after he dies, the dividing of the kingdom. 90 years. I mean, you're talking about almost 100 years. Anybody 100 years old in here? Okay. We're talking about something here before. It's like somebody predicting something about us, what would happen to us in 2023 before we were ever born. I mean, even beyond that, it's like someone after World War I. World War I. not two, World War One. Anybody here during World War One? Anybody fought in World War One here? Somebody in World War One talking about Putin taking over Ukraine. That's what we're talking. That's ridiculous. That's what God's doing here. Of course, he doesn't mention the names, but he says, okay, this guy from Greece, he's going to die, and his kingdom's going to be divided, but it's not going to be among his sons. And there's going to be 4 divisions among this. And then he begins to talk about these 2 of these divisions that fight over it. And that's exactly what happens. And this is written 90 years before it happens. 90 years before it happens. So we get to the 3rd division here, and that's the kings of the south and the north. South and the north, we're talking about 2 of those 4 divisions of Greece, 2 divisions of the Greek Empire. The south is the Egyptian, I guess you'd say, empire. It's the area around Cairo and Alexandria and all of that. There, the northern Africa and moving up. The north here that he's talking about is the area around Syria and Asia Minor and all of that. And that would be, and it's in relation to Jerusalem, to Israel. So the south would be that part, and the north would be the Syrian part. The south is the Ptolemaic dynasty, and the north is the Seleucid dynasty, and those are those first leaders there that take over, and their posterity as well. And here's Israel right in between the north and the south. And Israel is continually a part of this history, and is pulled back and forth between the 2. They're not conquering anybody; they're just being conquered. The south and the north are constantly fighting, and they're constantly going back and forth between these 2 divisions of the Greek empire. And as you see there in your outline, instead of trying to say this and then spell it for you and stuff like that, I just wrote it out for you, all of these guys. And so letter A there, you have Ptolemy I, Soter. He's the one that's over Egypt. The Ptolemaic Empire is over the Egyptian part, the North African part. And then you have Seleucus I, Nicator, and that is the one that's over the northern Syria, Asia Minor, that part. That is Syria is the capital there. And so these are the 2 initial rulers after Alexander dies that control these 2 divisions of the Greek Empire. And so look at verse 5. He says, also the king of the south shall become strong. So the south is down around Egypt. It says, as well as one of his princes, he shall gain power over him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. So the king of the south is Ptolemy, and he did grow strong. He grew strong initially. That part of the empire was stronger than the north. And here it's a little confusing because the issue is who is one of his princes? Who is the his? Is the his the king that we're talking about in chapters 3 and 4, or is the his the king of the south? And when you look at it, apparently he's talking about the king of, the one that took over after Alexander. So he's talking about this king of the north, because the king of the south was more powerful than the king of the north. And so here are these Greek leaders, the north and the south, and they're both rivals over this area in between, which is where Israel is. And both, the side, they're not just going to draw a line and say, okay, you don't cross this line. This is your part of the back seat. This is my part of the back seat. Don't cross. Mama, they're touching me. They're overcrossing their side. Y'all remember that? Riding in the back seat of the car with your brother or sister, and you have the line and stuff that they can't cross. That's kind of, it doesn't work that way. They're just constantly trying to take more and more because these are worldly, wicked rulers, and they just want more. And so it starts off here with the south being a little more powerful and greater domain, and they're in control of Israel at this time. And then you have the next leaders. After these guys die, they have got their sons come up after them. And letter B there, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, and then you have Antiochus II, Theos, that is over the north. And so they come in. And it's amazing. Verse 6 gets real specific here. This is just blows my mind as you begin to put world history up beside what's going on here. It says in verse 6 says, and at the end of some years they shall join forces, for the daughter of the king of the south shall go to the king of the north to make an agreement, but she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stand. But she shall be given up, and those who brought her, and with him who begot her, and with him who strengthened her in those times. You say, what's going on here? Well, let me just relate some history. So you got this son of Ptolemy, that's the king of the south, Ptolemy the second. And then you got this grandson of Seleucus the first, which is Antiochus the second, Theus. He is the one that is king of the north. And there's an attempt, as it describes here, of alliance. This is what history tells us happened. Ptolemy had a daughter named Bernice. And y'all know Bernice, don't you? Bernice was given as a wife to Antiochus. See, Antiochus is Seleucus' grandson, so there's an age gap. And so Ptolemy, the king of the south, wants an alliance with the king. So he gives his daughter to Antiochus to be his wife. And on one hand, the south is thinking, okay, now, if they have a son, that'll be my grandson. And so I'll be able to unite the north and south under our reign. Antiochus says, okay, if she's my wife and this is my son and that king dies, my son will be the heir of that down there. And so we'll have, and so they're both thinking about expanding their empire, but that's what they do. Neither one really happens, because it says there, notice in verse 6, it says that she shall not retain the power of her authority. So what's he saying here? He's saying it didn't work. You know why it didn't work? Because Antiochus had another wife. Antiochus' first wife, Laodice, I think that's how you say it. So you have Bernice and Laodice. Laodice didn't like Bernice and didn't like as her husband married Bernice. And so guess what she did? She assassinated Bernice and her son. And then she poisoned Antiochus. And so it didn't work. It didn't work. That's exactly what happened. And look at what it says there. It says, she shall not retain the power of her authority, and neither he nor his authority shall stay. That's exactly what happened. And this is written 300 years before that takes place. United States hasn't been around for 300 years. Okay? There's been no United States of America for 300 years. And so that's what we're talking about here. And it is perfectly fulfilled, just like it says here. Well, let's move on beyond that and see what happens. So letter C, we see Ptolemy the third, Euergetes. Y'all know him, don't you? He's down in the south. And then Seleucus the second, Callinicus, he's over the north. And so look at what it doesn't use their names, but that's where we're talking about the next ones that come. It says in verse 7, but from a branch of her roots one shall arise in his place, who shall come with an army, enter the fortress of the king of the north, and deal with them and prevail. The her is Bernice that we're just talking about up in verse 6. And Ptolemy the third, this new king, that's her brother, okay? That's down in the south. And so he attacks Syria in retaliation for his sister and his nephew's death. And so he attacks the north. And so they were in a war that lasted from 246 to 241 BC. And during this time, he took Syria and took the capital of Syria, just like it says, entering the fortress of the king of the north, and prevails. And that's exactly what happened. And then in verse 8 says, and he shall also carry their gods captive to Egypt with their princes and the precious articles of silver and gold. Guess what he did? He did exactly that. He took the treasures of the king of Syria and of the palace of Syria and all that they had and took them down to Egypt with him and to his palace. That's exactly what he did. History tells us. You can look it up in the historical books and stuff and see that. And it says, and he shall continue more years than the king of the north. He even took captives with him. It says, with their princes. He did that. He took captives with him back down to Egypt. And then in verse 9 it says, also the king of the north shall come to the kingdom of the king of the south. And that's what Seleucus did. After all this happened, he didn't like it, so he just says, well, I'm going to get it back. And he goes down and he attacks Egypt in 240 BC. But notice it says, but shall return to his own land. In other words, he returned with his tail between his legs because it didn't work. We're reading this that is 300 plus years future to Daniel, and it happened exactly like it said. Exactly. Verse 10 gets into the next one. So that's what happens. And so at this time, Israel's now under control of Egypt and Ptolemy. So he owns all that, all the way up to Syria and that land. And so you say, well, we're not really talking a lot about Egypt. And well, we're getting there, okay? And seeing what God's doing in this is he's revealing all this, is that as the people of Israel are going through this and they're seeing Daniel, they're going to see what's coming. The future is where it's going to get more important as we move on through this. But he's showing, I said this was going to happen, and it happened. I said this was going to happen, I'm in control. So when it gets tough, trust me. Trust me. Look to me. I'm in control. I'm in control. Well, let's move on here. And we see in letter D there, we see Ptolemy the Fourth, Philopator. He's over the south, and then Seleucus III, Cyrannus, and his brother Antiochus the Great, Antiochus III, he's over the north. And so this is during the time that Israel moves back to Syrian control. And so Seleucus II, these are his two sons, and they take back Israel, and especially Antiochus the Great, when he comes to power, it has a devastating impact, and it's moving towards some tough stuff. So let's try to work through this, and then we'll stop after this if we can get through it in the next 10 minutes or so. So here are the sons that come in. You have Seleucus III, and he only lasts 3 years in Antiochus the Great. Verse 10 says, however, his sons shall stir up strife. That king of the south that got whooped with his tail between his legs, his sons are going to change the course. And his sons shall stir up strife and assemble a multitude of great forces, and one shall certainly come and overwhelm and pass through. One of the sons, that's Antiochus the Great, shall overwhelm and pass through, and then he shall return to his fortress and stir up even more strife there. So Antiochus attacks Egypt. It says pass through. Where is he passing through? Israel. So that's what we're talking about here. And he says he overwhelms, he whoops up, and he on the Ptolemy that is there, and whatever number he is, Ptolemy the Fourth, and invades the fortress there, and takes some of the stuff back, and even takes some of Ptolemy's stuff back. So he's winning for the north now. And so in verse 11 it says, and the king of the south, you think he's going to sit there and take that? No. He shall be moved with rage and go out and fight with him. Fight with the king of the north. With the king of the north. That's what it says. It says, who shall muster a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into the hand of his enemy. So Ptolemy's upset, and he launches a counterattack. And he has, even though he has a great army there, he's overwhelmed by the army of the north. This is what history tells us, that the south, that they had 62,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry, and 73 elephants. And you say, well, that's a huge army. It is, but the north had 70,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry and 102 elephants. And so they whooped up on them and everything. It didn't work and stuff initially. And so the multitude will be given to the hand of his enemy. And it says, and when he has taken away the multitude, his heart will be lifted up. And so he begins to get prideful and arrogant in this. And so he says, and he will cast down tens of thousands, but he will not prevail. And so he's getting prideful over the ones that he has killed and wants to kill even more, but it just doesn't work out. Verse 13 says, for the king of the north will return and muster a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly, even more, and certainly come at the end of some years with a great army and much equipment. And so here he comes, and he conquers even more, and has the gains back everything, and so all of this takes place there. Verse 14 says, "Now in those times many shall rise up against the king of the south. Also violent men of your people shall exalt themselves in fulfillment of the vision, but they shall fall." So here he's talking about that these people, they rise up against the king of the south. And then he says, violent men of your people. And so he's talking about Daniel's people, the Jews. The Jews even join with this as well. Israel helps to rebel against Ptolemy. And they think that Syria and Antiochus up north is better for them. They're wrong. They're bad wrong. But that's what they're thinking. So they unite with the north, with Syria, against the south, against Ptolemy. And then in verse 15 it says, "So the king of the north shall come and build a siege mount and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist." According to history, it's talking about Sidon, a coastal city that the south controls, but Antiochus takes over. He takes from Egypt, fulfilling the prophecy even in Ezekiel chapter 28. I haven't got time to go into that, but that prophecy is fulfilled right here in talking about the same thing. And so by 198 BC, that's where we are in history at this time, Syria is controlling all the land north of the Nile. That's where we've gotten to. So the northern kingdom, Syria, the Seleucid dynasty, Antiochus the Great is their king right now, is controlling everything from the Nile northward. And Israel, of course, is included in that. Verse 16 says, "But he who comes against him shall do according to his own will, and no one shall stand against him. And he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power." So here he's talking about Antiochus the Great and how no one can dethrone him at this time, and all opposition against him is quenched. That's why he's called Antiochus the Great. And he has control over the glorious land, which is what? What's the glorious land? That's Israel. So he's in control over that as well. And then verse 17 says, "He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him, thus shall he do. And he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but she shall not stand with him or be for him." So Antiochus, what he wants is all of the south. He's got from the Nile northward, but he says, I want it all. And so he devises a plan to take the south. And right now, at this time, the Roman Empire is beginning to come on the scene. So he wants more power and more land because he recognizes over in the west something is stirring. And so he wants control of Egypt. He wants control of all of that because he wants to expand his domain and get ready for Rome that is coming. And so Ptolemy the Fifth in Egypt is down there, and to move toward that, he offers him, as it says here, his daughter, so they can be at peace, and so they can be united, and so that he can have influence over there. And you say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, history tells us who this lady's name is. Can you guess? Cleopatra. You ever heard of Cleopatra? That's who this is. It is Cleopatra. And so she moves into the south, and if you know the history, she begins to take over the south, but she ain't real keen about doing everything the north wants. She has her own agenda and her own plans and her own search for power herself. And we're not going to get into all of that. Verse 18 says, "After this, he shall turn to face to the coastlands and shall take many." And so the coastlands, that's along the Mediterranean Sea there. And that sounds good because it sounds like he's doing a good thing. But he says, "But a ruler shall bring the reproach against them to an end, and with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him." Because when he starts doing this, the Rome says, okay, Rome is gaining power there. And they go, I don't think we're going to let you take these ports. And they begin to move in and encroach upon Antiochus. And so verse 19 says, "Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. So he turns his focus back home. He's humbled a little bit because Rome's coming to power. He loses some influence in Egypt by his own daughter, by Cleopatra being down there, and then loses, Antiochus the Great isn't so great anymore. And he is soon killed by an angry mob, and that's exactly what happens. As we're reading through this, it kind of sounds like history, doesn't it? Sounds a lot. Some of you are going to sleep like in a history class. It sounds a lot. But remember, this is all future to Daniel. Everything, I'm putting history next to this. I'm hopefully helping you to do this. And we're looking at, this is hundreds of years ahead of Daniel. And everything happens exactly like it said. Can you understand why the enemy or why people attack this and say, there ain't no way. If you don't want to believe in God, you might better take Daniel 11 out of the book. If you don't believe there's a God who's really on the throne and who's really in control, you got to take Daniel 11 out of the book. But it don't come out of the book. It's right there. Right there. Now, we serve the same God. So what are you worried about? What are we worried about? Matter of fact, not only should we not worry about anything, but we should bow before this King. And we should cast off all restraints and not hold anything back, and serving and obeying and honoring this King. Because whatever he tells us to do is true. It is true. It's true. Let's pray together. Lord, help us to honor you, the true King, the only King, the one who knows everything. And may we quit living for ourselves or living according to the kings of this world and live for you. Lord, you are the God that every man, that every woman, that every boy, that every girl needs to know. So Lord, may we be faithful in pointing others to the true King. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.